The attorney's fingers trembled as he broke the wax seal. It was June 17, 1854, and the parlor at Belmont Manor in Natchez, Mississippi, had never known such profound silence. 15 people sat in that room watching James Whitfield unfold a document that would ignite a scandal so explosive it would dominate headlines from New Orleans to New York and force a court battle that would rage for 7 brutal years. Margaret Thornton occupied the center chair, draped in black mourning silk, her face a mask of composed grief. Having buried her husband of 3 years just 3 days earlier. Surrounding her sat their 4 children, her brother-in-law, her sister, 2 family attorneys, and several prominent witnesses from Natchez society, all present to ensure the proper transfer of one of Mississippi's largest cotton fortunes. What none of them knew was that in approximately 4 minutes, Margaret Thornton's entire world would collapse, because the man they'd just buried, Plantation master Robert James Thornton, had done something that no one in that room could have imagined, something that would violate every social code of the antebellum South, something that would force them all to confront truths they'd spent lifetimes pretending didn't exist. Attorney Whitfield cleared his throat and warned the assembly that the contents of the testament were highly irregular, insisting that Mr. Thornton had required every word be read exactly as written, without omission or summary. Margaret's sister Caroline whispered for him to just get on with it, having had enough drama. But they had no idea what was coming. Whitfield began reading the standard opening declarations of sound mind and revocations of previous wills, and Margaret's posture relaxed slightly as her oldest son Robert Juder, age 22, leaned back, already mentally calculating what he'd do with Belmont's 3,000 acres, while her daughters Elizabeth and Anne, both unmarried and in their 20s, exchanged glances of relief, knowing their future was secure. Then Whitfield reached the first bequest and his voice changed, becoming strained as he read that to his wife, Margaret Elizabeth Thornton. He left the sum of $1 to be paid within 30 days of his death. The room froze as Margaret's face went white, insisting there must be some mistake. But Whitfield continued, reading that to his sons Robert James Thornton Jr. and William Charles Thornton. He left the sum of $1 each, and to his daughters Elizabeth Margaret Thornton and Anne Caroline Thornton the same. Robert Jeter surged to his feet, declaring it insane since his father had over $400,000 in assets. But Whitfield insisted he must read the primary bequest, his voice barely above a whisper, his hand visibly shaking. The silence in that room was the kind that comes just before a storm breaks, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat pounding in your ears, the kind where every person present knows with absolute certainty that their life is about to change forever. Whitfield read that to Eliza Marie, a woman of approximately 32 years of age currently held as property at Belmont Manor. He granted immediate and unconditional freedom, and furthermore granted to her the entirety of Belmont Plantation, including all 3,100 acres of land, all buildings, equipment, livestock, and crop yields current and future. Someone gasped, and Margaret made a sound like she'd been struck in the chest. But Whitfield wasn't finished, continuing to grant Eliza his full ownership stake in Thornton Cotton Factoring Company, his shares in the Natchez Railroad Company, his property holdings in Natchez City proper, including the house at 42 Pearl Street, all bank deposits, bonds, securities, personal property, and currency in any form. Margaret stood so fast her chair toppled backward, crying out that this was forgery, and that Whitfield had written it himself to steal from her. But Whitfield insisted he had not written the will, that her husband had come to his office 6 weeks before his death and dictated it personally despite strong advice against the provisions. Margaret's voice rose to a shriek at the revelation that for 6 weeks Robert had sat in that house, eaten at her table, let her plan his future, and had already written her out of everything. Elizabeth started crying. Anne sat perfectly still with her face blank with shock. William looked like he might be sick, but Robert Ginder's face had gone dark red, the veins in his neck standing out as he demanded to know who Eliza Marie was. That was the question that would unravel everything, because everyone in that room knew exactly who Eliza Marie was. They just never allowed themselves to think about what she actually meant. Whitfield set down the will and looked at Margaret, what he saw in her face making him flinch, as he suggested the ladies should perhaps leave. But Margaret's voice was ice as she refused, demanding he explain how a woman who was property yesterday now owned everything she'd spent 23 years building. Whitfield quietly informed her there was more to read, and his voice cracked as he declared that the following children currently living at Belmont Manor were Robert's natural offspring and were to be freed immediately upon his death and provided for from the estate. Marcus age 9, Sarah age 6, and Thomas age 3. The room exploded as Robert Ginder started shouting. Elizabeth collapsed into sobs, and Margaret stood frozen with her mouth opening and closing without sound. Because what Whitfield had just read wasn't just about an inheritance. It was about 3 children everyone at Belmont had seen and known about and carefully pretended not to understand the significance of. 3 children who all had light skin and distinctive features. 3 children who looked unnervingly like the Thornton family. 3 children who were Robert Thornton's sons and daughter born to the woman who now owned everything. Margaret's sister Caroline found her voice first, asking if Margaret had known about the children. But Margaret wasn't listening. She was staring at a point on the far wall, with her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely human as she demanded to know where this woman who'd stolen her life was. A voice came from the doorway, quiet but clear, saying, "I'm right here." And every head in the room turned to see a woman in a plain gray dress standing in the parlor entrance, her posture straight, her expression carefully neutral. Eliza Marie was 32 years old, though she'd never known her exact birthday, with amber-colored eyes, dark hair pulled back severely, and skin the color of aged honey. She'd been born enslaved on a Virginia plantation, sold south when she was 14, and purchased by Robert Thornton in 1843 for what the records listed as household management duties. For 11 years, she'd lived in a small room behind the kitchen at Belmont, managed the household accounts, supervised the other house servants, raised 3 children in secret in the shadows, where no one would have to acknowledge what they were or who had fathered them. And now, according to the document James Whitfield held, she owned all of it. Margaret looked at Eliza, and something terrible passed between them. These 2 women who'd lived in the same house for over a decade, who'd both loved the same man in whatever twisted forms love could take in a world built on ownership, who'd both borne his children, who'd both constructed careful performances of their roles, mistress and servant, wife and property, each pretending the other didn't threaten everything she'd built her identity around. Margaret whispered that Eliza had known he was going to do this, and Eliza's face remained impassive as she confirmed he'd told her 3 days before he died. Margaret's laugh was horrible as she pointed out he'd given Eliza 3 days warning, and her none at all after 11 years in her house, fed and clothed and sheltered by her, asking how this was repayment. Eliza's voice was quiet but steady as she corrected Margaret, saying Margaret had never given her anything, that her husband purchased her. Everything she had, every moment of her life belonged to him. And to Margaret, she couldn't refuse anything, couldn't leave, couldn't protect herself or her children. And she wasn't repaying anything because she never owed Margaret anything. She was property. The word hung in the air like poison, and Robert Jeager moved toward Eliza with something in his posture that made Whitfield step between them, advising that any physical intimidation of Miss Eliza would be unwise. Robert Jeager's voice dripped venom at the use of Miss, but Whitfield firmly stated that Eliza was a free woman as of 3 days ago, per the legal terms of her father's death and the activation of the will. No longer enslaved with legal standing, and as of that moment one of the wealthiest property owners in Adams County. The absurdity of it was too much for some people in the room, as one of the witnesses, a banker named Pritchard, started laughing with high hysterical laughter that sounded like it might turn into screaming, and his wife dragged him from the room. Margaret was still staring at Eliza, demanding to understand why, what she'd done to make Robert choose her over his own children. And Eliza, who'd spent 11 years being careful, being invisible, being whatever she needed to be to survive, finally let something show on her face. Pain. Deep aching pain that had lived in her bones for so long it had become part of her structure. She said she didn't make him choose anything, that Margaret's husband made his choices every day for 11 years, choosing to come to her room, choosing to father children he knew would be born enslaved, choosing to keep them all trapped in a lie that protected him and destroyed everyone else. And at the end, when he was dying and couldn't lie to himself anymore, he chose to tell the truth. And she was sorry that truth had hurt Margaret. But Margaret was asking the wrong person why. It was the most Eliza had ever said directly to Margaret in 11 years, and it was the moment when everything that had been carefully contained, carefully managed, carefully buried beneath Southern propriety, finally erupted into open warfare. Margaret's brother-in-law Thomas Thornton, Robert's younger brother, and a lawyer himself who'd been silent, until now watching everything with calculating eyes, stepped forward and declared the will illegitimate, extracted under duress from a dying man, violating every principle of natural law and Christian morality, insisting it would not stand in any court in Mississippi. Whitfield insisted the will was properly executed, and Mr. Thornton was of sound mind, with every legal right to dispose of his property as he chose. But Thomas's voice cut through the room like a knife. As he argued, the law was clear that a Negro, even a freed Negro, had severely limited property rights in Mississippi, certainly couldn't inherit a plantation, own enslaved people, or manage business interests, making the will legally impossible. Whitfield quietly responded that Robert had anticipated these objections, including trust structures, guardian appointments, and legal mechanisms specifically designed to address them. But Margaret's voice had regained its strength, though. It shook with fury as she declared this was her home, her children's inheritance, their future. And she would burn this entire plantation to the ground before she let that woman take it. Eliza met Margaret's eyes steadily and told her to burn it, but it would still be hers when the ashes cooled. What happened next would consume 7 years, destroy multiple families, expose secrets that Natchez society had kept hidden for generations, and ultimately force a Mississippi court to confront questions about property, freedom, race, and power that the entire South was desperately trying to avoid answering. But in that moment, in that parlor with Robert Thornton 3 days dead, and his will finally read aloud, all anyone could see was the wreckage. Margaret, who'd lost everything except $1 in her fury. 4 children who'd just discovered they were worth less to their father than the children he'd kept hidden. And Eliza standing in the doorway of a house she suddenly owned with 3 young children she had to protect, knowing that every person in that room wanted her destroyed. The battle for Belmont Manor was about to begin, and before it was over, it would reveal truths about the antebellum South that history books would spend the next century and a half trying to forget. The hours after the will reading would later be described by household servants as the closest thing to war they'd witnessed without actual gunfire. Margaret Thornton didn't leave. Legally, she couldn't be forced to since the will granted Eliza ownership, but Margaret still had rights as the widow, even if Robert had tried to minimize them. So she stayed and made sure everyone knew she was staying. That first night, Margaret gathered her children in the master bedroom she'd shared with Robert for 23 years and made them swear an oath that Elizabeth would later testify about in court, vowing to fight this abomination with every legal weapon they possessed, expose that woman for what she was, prove their father was manipulated and poisoned against his own blood, and take back what was rightfully theirs, even if it took the rest of their lives. But while Margaret was rallying her children upstairs, something else was happening in that small room behind the kitchen, where Eliza had lived for 11 years. Eliza sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her 3 children pressed against her. Marcus at 9, old enough to understand some of what had happened, Sarah at 6 asking why the white lady was screaming, and Thomas, just 3, having fallen asleep in his mother's lap, exhausted by the day's chaos. Marcus whispered, asking if they were really free, and Eliza stroked his hair that was softer than hers, lighter brown with reddish tints in the lamplight, hair that came from his father. She told him the paper said they were free, but when he asked what that meant, she couldn't explain to a 9-year-old that freedom was more complicated than a legal document, that they were free in writing but trapped in a world that would never accept that freedom, that his father's final act of conscience had painted a target on all their backs. So instead, she said, it meant they were going to fight to stay together no matter what happened. What had happened between Robert Thornton and Eliza Marie was the story everyone in Natchez had whispered about for years, but never spoke aloud in daylight. And now, with the will made public, the whispers were about to become shouts. Robert Thornton had purchased Eliza in 1843 at a private sale in Natchez from a Virginia planter liquidating assets, and Eliza was listed as household trained, literate, excellent with figures. That literacy alone making her valuable and dangerous, since enslaved people who could read were watched carefully, restricted, often punished for the skill. But Eliza had been taught by a previous owner's wife who believed Christian duty required education, and the skill couldn't be unlearned. Robert paid $2,000 for her, nearly double the standard price, and his wife Margaret had been furious about the extravagance, demanding to know why they needed another house servant when they had 6 already and could have bought 3 field hands for that price. Robert's answer, recorded in Margaret's diary from 1843, was that Eliza could manage the household accounts, since Margaret was always saying she needed help with the books. And it was true, Margaret did need help. She'd never been good with numbers, and had never really wanted to be. Running a plantation the size of Belmont involved tracking hundreds of expenditures, recording crop yields, and managing inventories. Tedious work she was happy to delegate. So Eliza took over the books and was brilliant at it. Within 6 months, reorganizing Belmont's entire accounting system, catching errors that had been costing them thousands, and streamlining the supply ordering. Robert started consulting her on business decisions, asking her opinion on whether to invest in railroad stock and discussing cotton futures prices. Margaret noticed, of course, but told herself it was fine. It was just business. Eliza was property, a tool Robert used to manage affairs. Margaret didn't want to deal with anyway. It meant nothing. Then in early 1845, Eliza became pregnant, and the plantation midwife, an elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Bessie, would later testify that she knew immediately who the father was. That child came out with Mr. Robert's nose plain as day. Wasn't no question. And Miss Margaret knew too. She just looked at that baby when he was born, looked at Miss Eliza, then walked out the room and didn't say one word. Marcus was born in June 1845, and Margaret didn't acknowledge his existence for the first 3 months of his life, simply acting as if he didn't exist, as if Eliza hadn't given birth, as if nothing had changed, a performance of willful blindness so complete that even the other servants found it unsettling. But Robert acknowledged Marcus. Not publicly, since he couldn't without destroying his social standing, but privately in small ways that everyone noticed and no one mentioned. He had new quarters built for Eliza, slightly larger with better windows, made sure Marcus was never assigned field work, and kept close to the main house, brought books to Eliza's room, children's primers, readers, mathematics texts, teaching his enslaved son to read the same way he taught Robert Jr. Sarah was born in 1848, Thomas in 1850. 3 children in 6 years, all bearing unmistakable Thornton features. And through it all, Margaret maintained her fiction, never acknowledging the children as Robert's, never speaking to Eliza about them, never confronting her husband. Years later, in a letter to her sister Caroline, written during the court battle, Margaret finally explained her silence, asking what she was supposed to do. Leave him and go where? Live on what? Her father's estate was entailed to her brothers. She had 4 children to protect. If she made a scandal and accused Robert publicly, she would have been the one society punished, not him. Men have their indiscretions, everyone knows this. A wife's duty is to ignore them gracefully. She did what she was supposed to do, maintained the household, raised their legitimate children, performed her role perfectly, and this is how she was rewarded. But there was another layer to Margaret's silence, one she never quite admitted even to herself. Robert had stopped coming to her bed in 1844. Their youngest daughter Anne had been born in 1841, and after that nothing. For 13 years Margaret and Robert lived as married strangers, attending social functions together, discussing household management, presenting the perfect image of a successful planter family, but there was no intimacy, no connection, no private life together at all, because Robert was spending his private life with Eliza. And that was what made the will so devastating. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about a husband who'd chosen someone else, and had chosen her so completely that he'd given her everything Margaret had believed was hers by right. The legal challenge began within days of the will reading, with Thomas Thornton, Robert's brother, and a respected attorney in Natchez, taking charge of the case and filing a petition in Adams County Chancery Court, arguing the will was invalid on multiple grounds. First, he claimed Robert had been mentally incompetent when he dictated it, having been sick in his final months, with what the doctors called consumption of the lungs, probably tuberculosis, and Thomas argued the illness had affected his reasoning. Second, he claimed undue influence, that Eliza had been in a position of intimate access to Robert, and had manipulated him, seduced him, controlled him. A dying man in her thrall couldn't make rational decisions. Third, and most importantly, he argued the will violated Mississippi law. The state had strict regulations about manumission, freeing enslaved people. Even if Robert could legally free Eliza, he couldn't transfer property to her beyond very limited amounts. A freed black person couldn't own a plantation, couldn't inherit a business, couldn't manage enslaved workers. The will was asking Mississippi law to do something it explicitly forbade. Thomas's petition was filed on June 24, 1854, exactly 1 week after the will reading. The judge assigned to the case was Hiram Foster, a distinguished member of the Mississippi Supreme Court who'd agreed to hear this particular case at the circuit level because of its unusual legal complexities. But everyone actually knew was that Judge Foster had been friends with Robert Thornton, had done business with him, and probably wanted to make sure the case was handled in a way that protected Natchez society's interests. But Thomas Thornton miscalculated something crucial. He assumed the case would be straightforward, that any Mississippi judge would immediately invalidate a will that gave so much power to a formerly enslaved black woman. He didn't account for the one factor that would complicate everything, that Robert Thornton had been extraordinarily thorough. Attorney Whitfield, when he first met with Eliza to explain her legal position, brought a second document that hadn't been read in that parlor. A letter Robert had written to Whitfield, to be opened only if the will was challenged. Eliza sat in Whitfield's office in downtown Natchez, wearing the same gray dress she'd worn to the will reading, and Whitfield broke the seal on Robert's letter and began reading aloud. Robert wrote that if Whitfield was reading this, it meant his family was contesting the will which he expected, and he wanted Whitfield to know why he did what he did, and use this letter in court, if necessary. He wrote that he purchased Eliza in 1843 with specific intentions, having met her briefly at a previous sale and spoken with her. Recognizing her intelligence, orchestrating her purchase deliberately, and what began as a business decision became something else. Something he never intended, something he tried to resist, and something he ultimately couldn't deny. He fell in love with someone he had no right to love in a way their world says is impossible. Eliza's breath caught. Robert had never said those words to her, never told her plainly what she'd wondered about for 11 years. Robert continued that he knew what people would think, that he took advantage of someone he owned, someone who had no power to refuse him. And they were right. That's exactly what he did in the beginning. Exploitation dressed up in whatever lies he told himself. But over the years, Eliza became the only person he could be honest with, the only one who saw him clearly and didn't require him to perform. Margaret saw the planter, the businessman, the social figure. Eliza saw the man who was terrified of dying with nothing real in his life. Robert wrote that he had lived a coward's life, maintaining a marriage that died years ago, fathering children into bondage. His own children enslaved because he lacked the courage to do what was right. Building wealth on the labor of people he kept in chains, while pretending this was God's natural order. Telling himself these lies because the alternative was too painful. But dying had a way of stripping away every comfortable delusion. The letter went on for 3 more pages detailing his instructions for how Whitfield should structure the trust arrangements to withstand legal challenge, acknowledging that what he was doing would hurt his legitimate children, but arguing they would inherit their whiteness, their education, their social position, privileges his children with Eliza would never have unless he acted. And then at the end, Robert wrote something that would become the center of the entire case, freeing Eliza not as an act of charity, but as an acknowledgement of theft. He stole 11 years of her life, stole her children's childhood, stole their right to exist as human beings rather than property. This will was not generosity, but inadequate restitution, and if Mississippi law said a man couldn't restore what he'd stolen from someone he'd wronged, then Mississippi law was more corrupted than he was. When Whitfield finished reading, Eliza sat in silence for a long moment, then quietly said he'd never told her any of this in these words. Whitfield observed that men often find courage in letters they can't find in life, and warned that this letter was powerful evidence, but using it meant exposing everything: her relationship, her children, the intimacy of what existed between her and Mr. Thornton. The Thornton family would argue she seduced him, manipulated him. They'd say terrible things about her in open court, and he asked if she was prepared for that. Eliza thought about Marcus, Sarah, and Thomas, about the children growing up in the inn, between slavery and freedom, between black and white, between legitimate and illegitimate, about the future she could give them if she won this fight, and the future they'd have if she surrendered. And she responded that she'd been called terrible things her entire life. What were a few more insults compared to her children's freedom? But she had no idea what was actually coming, because the Thornton family wasn't just going to insult her. They were going to try to destroy her, and they were going to use every weapon antebellum Mississippi society had to offer. Weapons forged in generations of slavery, rape, denial, and the desperate need to maintain a social order that required some people to be human and others to be property. The first hearing was scheduled for August 1854, where both sides would present their arguments about whether the will should be probated at all. Judge Foster's courtroom was packed with every prominent citizen in Natchez. People stood in the back, crowded the aisles. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, but a public spectacle. Margaret attended dressed in her mourning clothes with her children beside her, having made sure Elizabeth and Anne looked pale and fragile, perfect victims of their father's betrayal, while Robert Jr. sat stone, face radiating barely controlled anger, the message clear that a respectable white family had been destroyed by an enslaved seductress. Eliza sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with Whitfield, having worn her plainest dress, no jewelry, hair pulled back severely, advised to look humble and non-threatening, to perform deference, even while fighting for millions of dollars. The performance required of both women in that courtroom said everything about the roles they were trapped in. Margaret had to perform wounded dignity. Eliza had to perform grateful humility. Both performances were lies, and everyone watching knew it. Thomas Thornton opened with a speech that would be reported in newspapers across the South, arguing that this case was not merely about one man's will, but about whether the foundations of their society could withstand attacks from those who would pervert natural law. That his brother, in his final illness, was corrupted by a woman who used her position in his household to extract an unnatural influence. Bearing his children, a crime against both his marriage and moral order, and now she sought to profit from her own wrongdoing. Whitfield responded with a careful, methodical argument, stating the question before the court was simply whether Robert Thornton had the legal right to dispose of his property as he chose. That Thomas argued his brother was incompetent, but he had 3 physicians prepared to testify that Robert was of sound mind until hours before his death. That Thomas argued undue influence, but he had Robert's own letter explaining his reasoning in detail. That Thomas argued Mississippi law forbade this transfer, but he had trust structures specifically designed to comply with every statute. Judge Foster listened to both sides, asked a few questions, then made a ruling that surprised everyone by ordering full probate proceedings, where both sides would have the opportunity to present witnesses, evidence, and expert testimony to examine Mr. Thornton's mental state, the validity of his relationship with Miss Eliza, the legitimacy of the trust structures, and whether Mississippi law permitted what this will attempted to do, adjourning until October for full proceedings. It was a victory for Eliza of sorts that the judge hadn't immediately dismissed the will. But it was also the beginning of something that would consume years of her life. As people filed out of the courtroom, Margaret and Eliza passed each other in the aisle, and Margaret stopped to look at Eliza directly for the first time since the parlor scene, telling her, in a voice low enough that only Eliza could hear, that she thought she'd won something. But all she'd done was guarantee everyone would know exactly what she was. And when this was over, when she'd been humiliated in public and exposed as a scheming, she'd wish she'd taken the dollar and disappeared. Eliza met her eyes and responded that when this was over, Margaret's children would still have their name, their skin, and their place in society, while hers would have their freedom, and she'd take that trade. They would never speak directly again, but the battle between them was just beginning. Between August and October 1854, Natchez society divided into camps with the precision of a military deployment. On one side stood the Thornton family and their allies, old money families who saw the will as an existential threat to everything they'd built their world upon. On the other side stood a much smaller, much quieter group, a handful of abolition, sympathetic merchants, several Quaker families, and a few people who simply believed a man should be able to dispose of his property as he wished, regardless of who benefited. But most people fell into a third category: those who watched with horrified fascination, unable to look away from a scandal that forced them to confront questions they'd spent lifetimes avoiding, because Robert Thornton's will hadn't just exposed one family's secrets. It had ripped open a wound that ran through every plantation, every fine house, every respectable family in the South, the unspoken arrangements, the children who existed in legal limbo, the women who occupied spaces between property and person, between servant and something else entirely. Eliza discovered just how deep that wound ran when she tried to buy supplies in Natchez, going to Henderson's general store, where Belmont had held accounts for 20 years, needing fabric, lamp oil, basic household goods. She handed her list to Thomas Henderson, who'd always been polite when she'd come in with orders from Margaret. But Henderson looked at the list, then at Eliza, then back at the list, and said he was sorry, but he couldn't extend credit to her, because the Belmont account was closed. Mrs. Margaret Thornton had closed it last week, and even if it weren't, he couldn't do business with her. He was truly sorry, but his other customers had made it clear they wouldn't shop there if he served her. Eliza felt the stares of the other people in the store, all white, all watching to see what she'd do. And when she offered to pay cash, Henderson said it wasn't about payment, but about his family's reputation. He had daughters to marry off, and couldn't be seen as supporting what she was doing, as if she'd engineered this, as if she'd written the will herself. Eliza left without the supplies, tried 2 more stores with the same result. Word had spread with the efficiency of a plague that anyone who helped Eliza would be socially destroyed. The white establishment of Natchez had closed ranks. That evening, a delegation of 3 women appeared at Belmont. Not the main house where they wouldn't go, but to the kitchen house where Eliza was supervising dinner preparation. These were women of color, free women who'd built lives in Natchez's small, free black community, and the oldest, named Joanna Price, spoke first, saying they'd heard what happened in town today and wanted her to know they had a network. Merchants who would deal with them quietly, suppliers who would deliver to the back door after dark. She was not alone in this. Eliza felt something crack in her chest. For weeks she'd been so focused on the legal battle that she hadn't let herself feel how isolated she'd become, and she asked why they would help her when they didn't know her. Joanna Price responded quietly, that they knew what she was, a woman who got free through circumstances most of them couldn't imagine, and now was fighting to stay free, while every white person in Natchez tried to push her back into bondage. If she lost this fight, it wasn't just her who lost, but every one of them. Because what she was proving was that they couldn't be trusted with freedom, that they couldn't manage property, that they weren't fully human. So yes, they were going to help her, because her battle was their battle. It was the first moment Eliza had allowed herself to understand what she actually represented. Not just one woman fighting for an inheritance, but a test case for whether someone like her could exist as a free property owner in Mississippi. And if she failed, it would justify every law that restricted free black people's rights. Every argument that they couldn't handle freedom, every rationale for keeping slavery intact. The weight of it was crushing. The full trial began on October 15, 1854, with Judge Foster's courtroom even more packed than it had been in August. Thomas Thornton had assembled an impressive legal team of 3 attorneys, all from prominent families, and they'd spent months preparing, interviewing every person who'd ever worked at Belmont, building their case with a strategy that was brilliantly cruel. They weren't just attacking the will, but attacking Eliza herself, destroying her character so thoroughly that no judge could possibly rule in her favor. The first witness they called was Margaret Thornton, who took the stand wearing black silk, looking every inch the grieving widow. Thomas Thornton conducted the examination gently, asking how long she was married to Robert, and she replied 23 years with a trembling voice, explaining she did everything a wife should do, bore him 4 children, maintained his home, supported his business endeavors, honored her marriage vows. When Thomas pressed further, asking even when, she stopped to dab her eyes with a handkerchief. And Thomas asked even when what, to which she responded even when she discovered he'd betrayed those vows with her, pointing directly at Eliza. Whitfield objected that the testimony was prejudicial and irrelevant, but Judge Foster overruled and allowed the witness to continue. Margaret's testimony was devastating because it was largely true, describing discovering Robert's relationship with Eliza in 1845 after Marcus was born, confronting Robert, who admitted the affair but refused to send Eliza away, and years of humiliation watching her husband's mistress live in her house and raise his illegitimate children under her own roof. When Thomas asked if she ever considered leaving her husband, she asked where would she go. A woman couldn't simply leave her marriage because she was unhappy. She had children to think of, a reputation to protect. She did what any Christian woman would do, forgave him, prayed for him, hoped he would see reason and end the relationship. But instead, he continued it for 13 years and then died and left her with nothing, breaking down crying. It was a masterful performance and it was working. Eliza could see it in the faces of the jury. 12 white men, all property owners, many of them married. They looked at Margaret with sympathy and at Eliza with disgust. When Whitfield cross-examined, he was gentle but firm, asking Margaret what Robert said when she confronted him in 1845, and she repeated his words that it was none of her concern. Whitfield asked if he ever promised to end the relationship, and Margaret said no, and when asked if he ever apologized, she paused and admitted no. Whitfield asked if in fact he didn't tell her explicitly that he would continue the relationship, and she would have to accept it. And Margaret's face hardened as she admitted yes. Whitfield pressed that she did accept it for 13 years, remaining in the marriage, continuing to benefit from the plantation's income, attending social functions with her husband, maintaining the fiction to the outside world that everything was fine. Margaret insisted she had no choice. But Whitfield quietly pointed out she had the same choices Eliza had. The difference was she could have left and Eliza couldn't. She chose to stay because the benefits outweighed the humiliation, while Eliza stayed because she was property. Thomas objected that counsel was badgering the witness. Judge Foster sustained and told Whitfield to move on. But the point had been made. Margaret had stayed in a marriage she knew was broken, because divorce would have destroyed her socially and financially. She chose respectability over dignity. That didn't make her the villain, but it made her a victim of the same system that enslaved Eliza, and it also meant her moral high ground was shakier than she wanted to admit. The next several days of testimony were brutal. The Thorntons calling servant after servant to describe Eliza's position in the household, and what emerged was a picture of a woman who'd held unusual power for someone enslaved, managing accounts, making decisions, having private conversations with Robert that excluded even his wife. But Whitfield's cross-examinations revealed something else: respect. Almost every servant, when pressed, admitted that Eliza had been fair, kind, even that she'd helped people, protected them from worse overseers, used her influence with Robert to prevent families from being separated. One woman, an elderly cook named Aunt Ruth, who'd worked at Belmont for 30 years and had known everyone involved, gave testimony that stopped the courtroom cold. Thomas Thornton asked if she observed the relationship between Miss Eliza and Mr. Robert, and she said she saw what there was to see. When asked if it seemed to her that Eliza had manipulated him or controlled him, Aunt Ruth looked at Thomas Thornton with eyes that had seen much of life to be intimidated by a white lawyer, and asked how someone with no power was supposed to manipulate someone with all the power. If he was asking if a woman who was property manipulated the man who owned her, that didn't even make sense. She explained Eliza bore his children because he came to her room, and she couldn't say no. That wasn't manipulation, but what happens when one person owns another person, and his brother wasn't manipulated. He just finally admitted what he'd been doing. Thomas tried to recover by suggesting Eliza must have used those children to extract sympathy too. But Aunt Ruth said those children looked just like Mr. Robert. Everyone could see it, everyone knew. The only person pretending not to know was Miss Margaret, and even she knew. She just couldn't say it out loud, because saying it would mean admitting her husband preferred someone else. The problem wasn't that Miss Eliza manipulated anyone. The problem was that Mr. Robert told the truth about something everyone wanted kept secret. It was the most honest testimony the court had heard, and Thomas Thornton quickly dismissed the witness, realizing she was doing more harm than good to his case. But the Thorntons had one more weapon, and it was the most devastating one of all. They called Dr. Samuel Morrison, the physician who'd treated Robert in his final months. An elderly, distinguished, and highly respected man in Natchez whose testimony was crucial because it addressed Robert's mental state. Thomas asked about Robert's condition, and Morrison explained he suffered from consumption of the lungs, which had progressed significantly by early 1854, causing fever, night sweats, severe coughing, and increasing weakness. When asked if this illness affected his mental capacity, Morrison hesitated and said consumption could affect the mind, particularly in its advanced stages. Fever could cause delirium. Physical suffering could lead to despair and irrationality. In his professional opinion, he believed Robert was physically suffering so much that his judgment may have been impaired. Whitfield's cross-examination was critical, asking if Morrison was present when Robert dictated his will to Whitfield, and Morrison admitted no. And when asked if he examined him that specific day, Morrison admitted no. And when asked if Robert ever in his presence said anything suggesting confusion about his affairs, inability to recognize people, or otherwise mentally incompetent. Morrison shook his head slowly and said no. Robert was always lucid when he saw him, spoke clearly about his condition, understood he was dying, and made rational decisions about his care. Whitfield pressed that Morrison's testimony about impaired judgment was speculation, based on his medical understanding of the condition, but he had no direct evidence that Robert Thornton was mentally incompetent when he dictated his will, and Morrison admitted he didn't. The testimony went back and forth for days. Witnesses for both sides, character assassinations and defenses, financial experts arguing about whether the trust structures were legal. Every intimate detail of Robert and Eliza's relationship dragged into public view. And through it all, Eliza sat in that courtroom, forced to listen as people debated whether she was human enough to own property, whether she'd seduced or been raped, whether her children deserved freedom or should remain enslaved. The psychological toll was immense, and at night back at Belmont, Eliza would sit with Marcus, Sarah, and Thomas trying to maintain normalcy while their entire world hung in the balance. Marcus, now 10, was old enough to understand some of what was happening and would ask questions Eliza couldn't answer, asking why they hated her so much, and she told him they didn't hate her, but what she represented. When he asked what she represented, how could she explain to a 10-year-old that she represented the lie at the heart of Southern society? That she was proof that the children of enslaved women and white men were human beings who deserved rights? That she threatened the entire social order, that said some people were property and others were people? So instead, she just held him and said she represented hope that things could be different. But the person who provided the most crucial testimony wasn't a character witness or a medical expert. It was James Whitfield himself, Robert's attorney who drafted the will and heard Robert's reasoning firsthand. Whitfield took the stand in early November, and his testimony would change everything. Thomas Thornton tried to discredit him by asking if it wasn't true that he stood to earn substantial fees, if this will was probated, and Whitfield admitted he was being compensated for his legal services, but had a professional obligation to defend his client's wishes, explaining Robert Thornton came to him 6 weeks before his death and dictated this will over the course of 2 full days. More lucid and purposeful than many clients he'd worked with, knowing exactly what he was doing. When Thomas demanded to know what his brother said, Whitfield pulled out his notes and read Robert's words that he was dying and had made many mistakes in his life, but had a chance to correct one of them. He wanted to free Eliza and provide for their children. He knew this would destroy his relationship with his legitimate family and cause a scandal, but he would rather die honestly than live one more day lying to himself. The courtroom went silent as Whitfield continued, reading Robert's acknowledgement that Margaret would never forgive him. His children would hate his memory. Natchez society would condemn him, but he accepted all of that because the alternative was dying knowing he enslaved his own children, kept the woman he loved in bondage, and was too much of a coward to face the truth. And he'd been a coward his whole life, but let him at least die brave. Thomas Thornton's face had gone pale at his brother's words documented in Whitfield's notes. Impossible to deny. But he tried to claim his brother was clearly not in his right mind if he said such things, that the Robert Thornton he knew would never. But Whitfield interrupted to say, the Robert Thornton Thomas knew was the performance he gave for Natchez society, and the Robert Thornton who dictated this will was the man beneath that performance who was exhausted from maintaining the lie. It was the turning point of the trial. Whitfield's testimony backed by detailed notes, and the letter Robert had written made it impossible to dismiss the will as the product of a confused mind. Robert had known exactly what he was doing, understood the consequences, and done it anyway. Judge Foster called for a recess after Whitfield's testimony, and when court reconvened a week later, he looked wary. The case had taken its toll on everyone involved. The final arguments took an entire day, with Thomas Thornton arguing passionately that the will violated Mississippi law, public policy, and moral order, while Whitfield argued that Robert Thornton had every legal right to dispose of his property as he chose, and that the trust structures complied with all relevant statutes. Then Judge Foster asked the question that cut to the heart of everything, asking Whitfield if he was truly arguing that Mississippi law should permit a Negro woman to own a plantation with enslaved workers, control business interests, and exercise the kind of economic power that had always been reserved for white men. Whitfield responded in what would become his most famous legal argument that Mississippi law already permitted free people of color to own property. The legislature had restricted those rights but not eliminated them, and more importantly, if a white man of property had the legal right to manumit enslaved people he owned and provide for them, then Robert Thornton had exercised that right. The fact that he chose to provide generously rather than minimally didn't make his actions illegal, but just unusual. When Judge Foster pressed that the magnitude of this bequest was beyond what the law contemplated, Whitfield argued with respect that the law didn't specify how much a freed person could inherit. It simply restricted their rights once they'd inherited. Miss Eliza, if she received this property, would still face all the legal restrictions that free people of color faced in Mississippi. She wouldn't be able to vote, testify in court against whites, or exercise many other rights. But owning property, the law permitted that, and if they were going to say the law had a secret cap on how much property a freed person could own, then they were inventing restrictions that didn't exist in statute. Judge Foster sat back in his chair, and everyone in the courtroom knew what he was thinking. This wasn't just a legal decision, but a social one. Rule for Eliza, and he'd be saying Mississippi law permitted a formerly enslaved black woman to become one of the wealthiest people in the state. Rule against her, and he'd have to invent legal reasoning that didn't quite exist in the statutes. He said he'd issue his ruling in 30 days, and then everyone waited. Those 30 days felt like 30 years at Belmont. An uneasy truce had settled over the plantation, where Margaret remained in the main house occupying the east wing, and Eliza stayed in her quarters behind the kitchen, though legally she now had the right to occupy any part of the property. Neither woman crossed into the other's space. They existed in parallel universes within the same walls, each pretending the other didn't exist. But the enslaved people at Belmont existed in a strange limbo. That was even more unsettling. They didn't know who owned them anymore. Was it Margaret as the widow? Was it Eliza according to the contested will? Or were they about to be sold to settle debts if the whole estate collapsed under the weight of legal fees? A man named Samuel, who'd worked the fields at Belmont for 15 years later, described the psychological torment, not knowing if they should pray for Miss Eliza to win or lose. If she won, they'd be owned by a woman who'd been enslaved herself just months before. If she lost, they'd probably be sold off to pay the lawyers. Either way, their lives weren't their own. But at least Miss Eliza knew what it felt like, and that counted for something. In Natchez, the case had consumed every conversation. Dinner parties debated the legal arguments, church groups discussed the moral implications, the local newspaper ran daily updates. People placed bets on the outcome. The case had stopped being about one family and become about the entire social structure of the South. And beneath all the public debate ran a current of fear, because if Eliza won, what did that mean for every other white man who'd fathered children with enslaved women? Could they follow Robert Thornton's example? Would there be a wave of deathbed confessions, wills that legitimized hidden families, legal transfers that upended the racial hierarchy? The establishment had to stop this, not just for the Thornton family, but for everyone with secrets to protect. On December 12, 1854, Judge Foster issued his ruling. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People stood in the hallways, crowded around the windows, desperate to hear the verdict that would define Mississippi law for years to come. Judge Foster looked exhausted, having aged visibly in the month since the trial began. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who knew his decision would satisfy no one. He said he had spent these 30 days in careful consideration of the law, the evidence, and the principles at stake in this case. And what he was about to say would disappoint both parties, but represented his best understanding of justice within the constraints of Mississippi law. Eliza felt her heart hammering as Whitfield sat perfectly still beside her. Regarding Mr. Robert Thornton's mental capacity, Judge Foster found that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the conclusion that Mr. Thornton was of sound mind when he dictated his will. Dr. Morrison's testimony about potential impairment was speculative. Mr. Whitfield's detailed notes demonstrated a man who understood his actions and their consequences. This will was not the product of delirium or diminished capacity. Margaret made a small sound of distress as her attorney gripped her arm. Regarding undue influence, Judge Foster found no evidence that Miss Eliza coerced or manipulated Mr. Thornton. The relationship between them, while morally troubling to many, did not constitute legal undue influence. Mr. Thornton made his choices freely, as evidenced by his letter and testimony from multiple witnesses. Thomas Thornton's face darkened as he could see where this was heading. However, Judge Foster continued, and that single word made everyone in the courtroom tense. He must address the fundamental legal question of whether Mississippi law could permit what this will attempted to do. He paused, looking directly at Eliza, noting that under the terms of this will she would become one of the largest property owners in Adams County, controlling enslaved workers, managing business interests, exercising economic power that had traditionally been reserved for white male citizens. The question was not whether Mr. Thornton had the right to free her. He did, but whether he had the right to transfer this magnitude of property to a freed person of color. On this point, Judge Foster found that Mississippi law was ambiguous. The statutes restricted the rights of free people of color, but did not explicitly forbid property ownership or inheritance. Whitfield leaned forward. This was better than he'd hoped. Therefore, Judge Foster ruled that Robert Thornton's will was valid and should be probated with modifications. The courtroom erupted and his gavel cracked like gunfire as he demanded order. And when the room quieted, he continued that Miss Eliza shall receive her freedom as stipulated in the will, custody of her 3 children, Marcus, Sarah, and Thomas, who shall also be freed. These provisions were unambiguous and legal. Eliza felt tears running down her face. Her children were free. Whatever else happened, that was permanent. However, Foster said with a heavier voice, he could not allow the transfer of the entire estate as written. Such a transfer would violate the spirit of Mississippi law regarding property ownership by freed people of color, even if it didn't violate the letter. Therefore, he ordered the following distribution. Miss Eliza shall receive Belmont Plantation's north tract of approximately 800 acres, along with the buildings thereon. $50,000 in liquid assets to be held in trust and administered by a white guardian appointed by this court, and her personal effects and those of her children. $50,000 was substantial, and 800 acres was a fortune. But it was a fraction of what Robertsville had specified. The remainder of the estate, the south tract of Belmont, the Natchez properties, the business interests, and additional liquid assets shall be divided among Robert Thornton's legitimate heirs, his widow Margaret and their 4 children, in proportions determined by standard inheritance law. Margaret gasped. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Her children would have inheritances, and she would have property. Furthermore, Judge Foster continued. He was ordering that the enslaved workers at Belmont be divided between the 2 estates. Miss Eliza shall not own enslaved people, as the court found this morally unconscionable, given her recent status. Those workers shall be transferred to the Thornton family estate or sold, with proceeds divided appropriately. Eliza felt the decision like a physical blow. She'd won her freedom and her children's freedom. But the people she'd lived beside for 11 years would remain enslaved. She'd fought so hard, and still the fundamental injustice continued. Judge Foster concluded that this ruling attempted to honor Robert Thornton's intentions while respecting the legal and social realities of Mississippi. Both parties had 30 days to appeal to the state Supreme Court if they chose, and he banged his gavel adjourning the court. The courtroom exploded into chaos as reporters rushed out to file stories. Spectators argued loudly about whether the ruling was just. Margaret's family surrounded her, debating whether to appeal, and Eliza sat very still, trying to understand what she'd just won and lost simultaneously. Whitfield turned to Eliza and told her this was a victory. She was free, her children were free, she had property and money, and they could appeal for more. But Eliza quietly responded that every day they spent appealing was another day her children lived in uncertainty. And every day Margaret Thornton spent fighting them was another day she couldn't rebuild her life. This needed to end. Whitfield asked if she was saying she'd accept this ruling, and Eliza thought about Marcus, Sarah, and Thomas, about the 800 acres that would be theirs, about the $50,000 that could educate them, establish them, give them futures she'd never imagined possible, about the cost of continuing this battle not in money, but in humanity, and she said yes. She'd accept it. On the other side of the courtroom, Margaret was having a similar conversation with her attorneys. Thomas Thornton wanted to appeal to fight for the full estate. But Margaret, looking across the room at Eliza, seemed to have reached some internal conclusion and said no more. They had enough to rebuild. Her children had inheritances, she had property, and she was so tired of fighting over Robert's corpse. Her voice breaking on the last words, because that's what this had all been, a battle over a dead man's legacy, a fight about who he'd loved more, who deserved what, who would carry his memory forward. The 2 families left the courtroom separately. They would never speak again, but they would remain connected forever by the man who had loved them both in different ways, and who destroyed them both, trying to make amends for crimes he couldn't undo. The property division took 3 months to finalize, and in March 1855, Eliza took possession of her 800 acres, the north tract of Belmont, with its own main house smaller than the original, but substantial. The trust fund was established with a banker named Harrison Wells serving as guardian, one of the few Natchez businessmen who'd agreed to work with Eliza partly from principle and partly from the profit opportunity. Margaret and her children took the South Tract and the Natchez properties. The cotton factoring business was sold with proceeds divided, and the enslaved workers were divided by lot a process that separated families and destroyed lives just as it always did. Samuel, the field worker, who'd spoken about the psychological torment, was sold to a Louisiana planter, eventually escaping during the Civil War and making his way north. And in a memoir written years later, he described watching Eliza on the day of the division crying, while they split them up. Crying like her heart was breaking. And he thought she knew exactly what this felt like. She just didn't have the power to stop it. That's what freedom meant for her. She could save her own children, but not anybody else's, and he'd spent years trying to decide if he forgave her for that, and still didn't know. Eliza moved into her new house with Marcus, Sarah, and Thomas in April 1855, and for the first time in her life she owned the space she lived in. For the first time her children slept in beds that belonged to them. For the first time they could read books openly, play freely, exist without constantly performing subordination. But the freedom was complicated. Natchez society never accepted Eliza. White merchants still refused to deal with her directly. She had to conduct all business through Harrison Wells or other intermediaries. Her children were educated at home because no school would take them. Too black for white schools, too wealthy for the colored school, too ambiguous to fit anywhere. The isolation was profound. The free black community that had supported Eliza during the trial remained friendly, but she existed in a strange social space between worlds, too elevated by wealth and property ownership to fit comfortably with others of her race, too marked by her skin and history to ever be accepted by whites. Marcus, as he grew older, became increasingly bitter about this isolation, and on his 16th birthday in 1861, he asked his mother why they didn't leave Mississippi, go north where their money could buy them genuine freedom. Eliza looked at the land she'd fought so hard to claim and told him his father gave them this. It was theirs. If they left, they were saying they'd won, that they didn't deserve to be there, didn't belong there, and she wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But history would make the decision for her. The Civil War began 3 months later. Mississippi seceded, and Belmont Plantation, both North and South tracts, struggled as the economy collapsed. By 1863, Union forces controlled Natchez. The enslaved people at the Thornton Tract fled to Union lines, leaving Margaret with land she couldn't work, while Eliza's tract, having fewer workers and more liquid assets, survived slightly better but barely. In 1864, Marcus enlisted with the Union Army, one of thousands of black men who fought for the freedom his mother had achieved through a white man's guilt, and he survived the war and returned to Belmont in 1866, wearing a Union uniform to the land his father had left him. Margaret saw him return. She was 63 by then, widowed twice, having remarried briefly in 1860, but her second husband had died at Vicksburg, and she watched Marcus ride up the road in his blue uniform, a freed black man who'd fought to destroy the world she'd grown up in, and she felt nothing but exhaustion. They passed each other on the road between the North and South tracts one day in 1867, both older and weathered by war and loss, and Marcus tipped his hat to her, a gesture of respect